Це 16 грудня.
It's 16th of December, which Ukraine met with another missile strike by Russia. However, the Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation, and now we will be talking about the food security in the world and in Ukraine and the condition of our agrarian industry. Our guests had to visit us here in the studio, but due to the security situation, we will be communicating with them online, but that's way better. So our guest today will be Denis Bashlik, the Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy of Food and of Ukraine, Pierre Vauthier, for Ukraine designated responsible officer, and Anna Burka, Grant Analyst at FAO in Ukraine. Well, our first speaker is Mr. Denis. Mr. Denis, there was a research, we know, the thorough study of the situation. What can you please tell us about the condition of the agrarian industry in Ukraine? Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Well, I appreciate this event happening at least online. So notwithstanding the missile strike today, we have to continue working, and we don't have to show the enemy that we stop. Our main purpose today is to present the results of the work of FAO with agricultural industry of Ukraine. Going a little bit ahead, we understand that the figures are not as good as we expected. Back in September, the analysts, together with the Ukrainian business school, they presented the new figures of the losses in agrarian industry of Ukraine. So it was $6.6 billion of direct losses back then, the forecasted figures. They were due to destroyed grain silos, stolen products, or destroyed products. Also, there is such thing as indirect losses. For example, under-received profit, ecological losses, and indirect losses reached $34 billion back then. The FAO figures say that 25% of the agricultural producers stopped growing crops, and the situation is complicated in all the industries. And we understand in a situation like this, when almost all the industries stopped, all the manufacturing stopped, the agrarian industry remains a locomotive of the Ukrainian economy. I want to remind you that before the war, Ukraine was the world leader in export of a number of crops such as corn, sunflower seeds, and was feeding 400 million people all around the world. On top of Ukraine having created 40% of the Ukrainian export. So now we already see the consequences, and we see the decrease of the harvesting area of winter crops. They are around 30–35% decrease. Every day is difficult, but we think our agrarians, they are heroes. They continue working no matter the daily bombardments, no matter all the complications of the logistics or mined fields. And we, on our hand, together with our international partners, we try to support them, to provide them with all necessary materials and means and equipment, like providing them with the temporary storage sleeves. That initiative was implemented in cooperation with FAO, and we appreciate it a lot. We have to understand that without international support, it would be very difficult today, and we feel that now we stand united in this fight. We're not alone. Apart from the targeted support, as with the sleeves for grain storage, the analytic work is very important, which is also supported by our international partners, because it's another instrument for taking useful and weighted decisions for future. and understanding how stressful is the situation for Ukrainian economy now, we don't have a space for mistake. So we need this data today a lot. So once again, I want to thank our international partners and our Ukrainian agrarians who, no matter all the threats, they continue working. And the research will become a necessary instrument for taking further decisions and compensations when we will be paid reparations. Mr. Denis, now that we're having this online format, we won't be able to communicate with all of you to ask all the questions that you ask. So let's take a couple of questions from the studio, and this is how we will work with all the guests. If there are any questions, please let us know. Good morning, Anastasia Kravchenko, Ukrinform. I have a question regarding the sowing campaign in spring. Does the Ministry of Agriculture have any forecast? How much are we going to be able to sow? We see the situation now is very dynamic, so it's very difficult to make any precise forecast. We understand it will be difficult due to three main issues: the deficit of the seeds, the deficit of turnover costs, and the deficit of electric power. So those are the three main factors which will impact the sowing campaign. But in cooperation with our international partners, we try to minimize those risks existing today. The day before yesterday, there was a visit of our team to France, where we agreed to procure seeds, and we continue working with other donors in these fields, and together with FAO, we are about to implement this program shortly. There's also need for generators in the industry. About 1,000 generators are required. We understand all the risks, and I think that we will make it because there is no other option for us. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Denis. So let's proceed to our next speaker. It should be Pierre Vauthier, the head of our office in Ukraine. We're asking our technical team to switch. I'm reminding you we had to speak offline in this studio, but due to the missile strike, this is how we communicate now. Okay, we're seeing our guest. Good morning, Mr. Pierre. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for finding this opportunity to get in touch with you. Please, can you say a few words about the situation, about your reserve?
Okay, so thank you very much, Дякую. I will have to speak in English. I apologize, my Ukrainian is basic.
Okay.
So I will be very brief today. As you know, I will just remind a bit what FAO is doing in the country. In collaborations with the Ministry of Agrarian Food.
Please continue.
So 4 points are important. The first one is the assistance we provided, as you know already, to support the farmers, to store the seeds, to store the grain. So we provided 6 million tons of grain storage capacity in 2022. So this operation will continue next year. As Denis explained, we will have now to focus on the seeds distribution for the spring, the generator distributions, and also, again, some storage, in particular in a newly accessible area. This is important for the continuity of the economy of Ukraine, but also for the global food security for 2023. The second point is related to some actions we will have to continue to develop in order to enhancing the capacity for alternative export roads and access to infected land with mines or UXOs in the future for Ukraine, in order to increase the capacity of export to continue, but also to increase the access to the land to be cultivated. This is second. The third point is about assisting the rural populations, in particular in the front line, in the oblast affected directly by the war, by the airstrike and by the shelling. And this year in 2022, we provided assistance to 40,000 households, and FAO, together with the Ministry of Agrarian Policy and Food, intend to increase this assistance to these populations, and we will explain why today, to 500,000 people that needs to be assisted urgently in order to resume their activity and to get not dependent on the food assistance. And this is very important because the rural populations that you know well are really in the front line. They are not receiving necessarily the assistance because they are not commercial farmers from the normal system of support to farmers. And at the same time, they are not also receiving necessarily always the assistance for humanitarian assistance, as they are in the countryside and they are not often registered in the list of people to be assisted. And we do believe that these populations, composed in particular of elder people, needs to be assisted with specific assistance in order to help them to resume their agricultural activities. And that's bringing to me my 4 points. I will explain. And today we're going to present you, Anna Burka, our colleagues, the result of the assessment, and this is the 4 points that we're doing, assessment with the Ministry of Agrarian Policy and Food on the vulnerability of these populations. And we are very concerned in FAO as this population in the countryside has been seriously affected by the war and the situation is worsening at the moment. But Anna Burka, our specialist in food security and analysis, is going to present you in details the assessment we did in October, directly interviewing the beneficiaries, the households in the country. So we did an interview for all the at national level with 5,300 households directly interviewed. And she's going to present you the result to explain why we need to assist and what is the vulnerability of this population and how we can solve the problem.
Any questions? Окей. Я тоді запрошую, дякую пане П'єре, я тоді запрошую нашого наступного спікера підключити нашу технічну команду. Це Анна Бурка, провідна аналітикиня з досліджень ФАО в Україні, яка, якщо я не сказала, і нам і презентує більш детальні цей звіт.
Now we will proceed to our next speaker, Anna Burka, who will present the research in detail. The research Mr. Paul mentioned, Mr. Pierre mentioned, I'm sorry. Good morning, everybody. As I was already introduced, my name is Anna Burka, and I'm doing the analytics for FAO. I would like to present the key results of our research. The purpose of our study was to assess the influence of war in the rural areas, to see the structure of change of the income in the rural areas, how did the manufacture, the production change, and how did the spending change for homes. I would like to mention that this study is just a component of the big study, which is called to see the influence of war, to study the influence of war on the rural population. Now it's about 30% of the population of Ukraine who lives in the rural areas, and the dominating manufacturing industries are production of vegetables. 27% of the potatoes are made by the home economies of Ukraine. I will tell you about our target audience, about the breakdown. As Mr. Vauthier just mentioned, we questioned more than 5,000 representatives of rural population in 22 regions of Ukraine, including in partially occupied Luhansk and Kherson regions. The most respondents were the men. The average age of our respondents was 53 years. And if we look at our map on the left, well, you can see the big yellow circles, and it shows that we completed the comprehensive analysis of the communities in the most vulnerable regions along the front lines. The next slide. Well, under our study, we divided the regions into three categories. They are the regions on the front lines, central Ukraine, and western Ukraine, as you can see on this map. And now we will be talking about the influence of the war on the income of the population in rural areas. I would like to emphasize that the majority of the homes, they rely on certain sources of income. Like pensions and social incomes, and the second is the income from agricultural activities, the involvement in state sector, teachers, lawyers, doctors, and the third source of income is the income from the agricultural activities. So the activities in the farms, growing of and sale of crops and vegetables, or the products of cattle industry. In our study, there was also a part of the population which rely completely on the income from agricultural activity. More than 50% of our respondents reported about the falling of their income. In this map, you can see that the rural households reported very drastic decrease of income in all regions of Ukraine. More than out of those 50% who reported fall of income, emphasized drastic and substantial fall in income. What I mean by that is more than 25% more than 5% or more than 50% decrease of income. Besides, our study also showed that internally displaced persons and the individuals who return to their homes are the category most vulnerable to the decrease of income. The majority of households along the front lines, in those households we observe the most drastic, the most dramatic decrease of income. In Sumy, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Mykolaiv regions, the percentage of households who reported the fall of income is substantially higher than in the rest of the regions of Ukraine. Besides, in parallel with the decrease of income, a part of the households started borrowing more debt from the beginning of the war. On the next slide, we can see the level of income of households which rely on profits from agricultural manufacturing, agricultural production. So we've seen that the households which depend on agricultural production and their related activities, they suffered most. They were affected most by the loss of profit. It's applicable to the most of the country, but it's mostly demonstrative in regions like, for example, Sumy, where more than 90%, and we can see in Donetsk region almost 90% of respondents reported fall of profits, the loss of profits that they were previously getting from agricultural activities. The next thing we wanted to discuss is how the war influenced the production of agricultural products in households. So, according to our study, almost 25% of the rural population involved in agricultural activities either stopped or decreased the scale of manufacturing due to the war, and this percentage is much higher in the areas along the front lines, which we can clearly see from the map on the right. If at the national level it's 25%, in the regions along the front lines, this figure reaches almost 40%. The next slide, please. And if we put all the components or elements that we researched in one map, in one slide, we will be able to see that the dramatic or substantial fall of income was due to the decrease of the scale of manufacturing, which in its turn was due to the reduction of the internal costs of manufacturing of agricultural production in cattle industry and crops growing. Also, according to the estimates as of September, in the households, the losses related to agricultural activities amounted to 2.3 billion United States dollars, including $1.25 billion in crops growing and almost $1 billion in cattle industry. And let's discuss the expenditures for food products and how it changed during the last months of war. According to our study, the majority of the households rely on their own food production. However, at the same time, substantial percentage of the households reported markets and general stores as the main sources of food procurement. So we see also that in the front line, substantial source of food is humanitarian aid. Many respondents also emphasize that they spend more than 50% of their income specifically for food products. What's of most concern is the fact that in the regions along the front lines, more than 20% of the households reported that they spent more than 75% of their income for food products. If we see this graph on the right, we see the front lines is a very the darkest color square. And the next slide, please. I will stop at one issue is the strategies of overcoming the crisis. The strategies of overcoming the crisis are those used for solution of some problems that some solutions that we would not have applied in our regular lives. So there are three of them: stress strategies, crisis strategies, and the way we call them, the emergency strategies. The stress strategies include such strategies when people start selling their property, like furnitures or TV sets, radios, other appliances, something that we can report as property. Another way is when people start borrowing money to cover their basic needs, such as food, medical services, access to dwelling. And as to the crisis strategies, those are the strategies when people start selling their manufacturing assets, their production assets. They reduce the costs for procurement of mineral fertilizers, veterinary services, and fodder for animals. And the strategy most complicated for the people is when they use the emergency strategies. That's, for example, when the people start selling their land plots, their homes, their real estate, or sells the last reproductive cattle. If we check this graph, we see that on the national level, about 40% of the households already started using the crisis strategies. At the same time, we see that there is a large percentage of the households who did not resort to any strategies. What's of the most concern, though, is that in the regions along the front lines, the percentage of the households is pretty high among those who use the crisis strategies and emergency strategies. If we see the graph on the left, the regions along the front lines, 6% of the households there started resorting to the emergency strategies. Talking about the complications and the needs of the households, among their main requirements, their main needs are the cattle fodder. And talking, if we talk about the cattle sector and talking about the crops growing, is the seeds material. About the difficulties that our households were expecting to face is the access to fuel, access to the electric power supply, to cattle fodder, and access to the seeds material. That's it for me now. I would maybe we may ask you some questions. Yes, sure. If possible. Oh yeah, we're seeing you now, Miss Anna. We're seeing the situation is developing. It's developing dynamically. The dynamics is negative. So the question is as follows: when are we going to see the bottom? What will it mean for Ukraine, for the agrarian sector, for people who live in rural areas, and what will it mean for food security of both Ukraine and the world? Well, it's a complicated question because, as you mentioned correctly, the situation is changing very rapidly, and I would not be probably able to forecast when we see the bottom and how the war will further influence it. We can say that the internal cost of the agricultural products will grow, and both our households and agricultural businesses will feel it difficult within the next seasons. And obviously, I would not like to give you some pessimistic forecast, but as to the study of the losses suffered by the households, the Ministry of Agrarian Policy showed their figures, but as you mentioned correctly, the situation is very dynamic and those figures will most likely grow. If my colleagues may add something, maybe Mr. Gautier or Miss Victoria. Well, Victoria Michalchuk, the spokesperson of FAO, I would like to put her on the screen. Maybe she can summarize our unexpected virtual report. Well, dear colleagues, first of all, I want to thank Ukrinform and Ukraine Media Center. Thanks for making it possible for us to organize this briefing. To summarize, I would like to say that the results of the study are not as good as we expected. FAO helped more than 5,000 households who reside in the rural areas, and within the next week we will provide more aid to them, more support to them. I would like to add some positive things, that yes, we may see the bottom soon, but we hope not to see it, and the international community takes all reasonable efforts so we don't see the bottom. And on our end, we expect to distribute the cattle fodder, which are very necessary, specifically in the areas along the front line. 27,000 households will receive this kind of aid. We continue providing financial support, monetary support to the people residing in the areas along the front lines. In year 2023, in cooperation with the Ministry of Agriculture of Ukraine, we developed the strategy, and we finish our previous program. FAO needs $205 million to support Ukrainian agricultural sector. We need $100 million to support 500,000 households who reside in the areas along the front lines, so they cover their basic needs for food and they can continue agricultural productions. We hope a lot that the situation will change to the better. So I would like to finish our summary with a positive note. So we hope for the best. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead. If not, I would like to thank Ms. Rina for summarizing. We were talking to the Ministry of Agricultural Policy and the organization called FAO, which is a United Nations organization. We were talking about the food security in Ukraine and abroad. Our next briefing is at 12:30. See you shortly.
Ось така історія.